At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. Most species meet an annihilation fleet with a counterfleet. Humanity sent Dr. Emery's, whose primary weapon was a deep and abiding understanding of how things fall apart. The only sounds were the puffing of the shuttle's air scrubbers, a steady rhythm mocking the traitorous thrum of Emery's own heart. He tried to count the beats, to force his chaotic biology under the heel of his intellect. His biology refused. Outside the viewport, the Axiom Annihilation Fleet hung in the star-dusted gulf. Hundreds of vessels shaped like sharpened splinters of polished jet formed a flawless geometric array. Their hulls drank the starlight, creating patches of absolute blackness where distant suns ought to be. Below their web of order, Earth was the struggling fly. His home, a bruised, beautiful marble, its orbital defense grid a string of fading, winking embers. The Axiom dismantled the last human stations with the detached care of an archivist, shelving old books. Encrypted channels that should have screamed defiance now offered only a chorus of static and automated distress calls, a digital death rattle he'd muted an hour ago. He forced his gaze from the dying sky to the floor, where a standard-issue xenobiological survey kit sat latched to the deck. The word diplomatic from his briefing was a bitter alkaloid on his tongue, a chemical untruth. He was a diplomat in the way a scalpel is a tool for reconciliation. He remembered the final briefing, the faces of the generals in high command, drawn so tight with desperation they looked like ceramic masks about to crack. They'd walked him through the psychological profile of the fleet's commander, High Strategos Volcaire, a being of supposed perfection with a single exploitable flaw. "He is an artist," General Adjua spoke, his voice a rasp of static. "A connoisseur of the abnormal. His battle arrangements, while strategically sound, always contain a flourish, an unneeded aesthetically pleasing pincer movement, a perfectly symmetrical flank." "He collects things," another analyst added, pushing a data slate across the table. "Testimony from a captured hierarch. Under extreme persuasion, he called them flawed artifacts from lesser cultures. Volcaire is a collector of broken things, Doctor. He finds beauty in chaos." So, they bet the entire species on a single horrifying premise. They didn't send a soldier to fight a general or a diplomat to negotiate a treaty. They sent a predator to a connoisseur of predators. And Emery's, a quiet man who preferred the company of petri dishes and chemical formulae, was their predator of choice. He was humanity's foremost expert on the deconstruction of the Axiom species. He knew their breaking points better than anyone alive. The thought brought only the chill of a monster set to parley with another. The shuttle jolted, a deep resonant thud echoing through the hull as magnetic clamps locked them to the flagship. The pressure shifted, making his ears pop. A low hiss signaled the airlock cycling. The air bleeding into the cockpit smelled of super-chilled metal and a clean, sharp scent like petrichor on hot ceramic. The inner door irised open. The hangar bay beyond was breathtaking. The chamber was more than large. It was a statement. A vast, sterile cathedral of order so perfect in its dimensions and lighting, it felt less like a chamber and more like a geometric proof rendered in 3 dimensions. 2 Axiom guards flanked the entrance. Their height defied human proportions. Clad in form-fitting, non-reflective black armor, their elongated skulls and sinewy frames gave them the lethal grace of starving wolves. Their wide, unblinking eyes, black sclera with no visible pupils, fixed on him. They were monoliths of silent, disciplined death. Emery's unstrapped himself from the crash couch. His movements felt clumsy and loud in the heavy quiet. He grabbed his kit, its handle cool and solid in his sweaty palm. He walked down the ramp, a lone rumpled human in a simple gray flight suit. He kept his posture deliberately open, a study in harmlessness. He looked small, soft, and hopelessly out of place. He stopped a few feet from the guards, tilting his head back to meet their flat, insectoid gaze. The quiet deepened, a test of will he intended to lose on his own terms. He heard a few guards mutter amongst themselves. "By the void, do all humans look like they have a rod up their intestinal tract? Do they all look fleshy like this?" A few of his buddies snorted with amusement. Emery spoke in a calm, conversational tone, laced with a dry, almost academic curiosity that was entirely genuine. "Your commander seeks to understand and negotiate with humanity," he stated, his voice calm and even. "He collects broken things, flawed artifacts. He wishes to put us in a display case. But you cannot study a predator by placing it under glass." He met the gaze of the nearest guard, his own eyes suddenly devoid of warmth. "I have been sent to provide a practical demonstration of why." One guard's four-fingered hand, wrapped around the stock of a sleek energy rifle, twitched. The micro-reaction, a flicker of disciplined defense, was instantly suppressed, but Emery saw it. The first data point. He'd just fired the first shot in this war. His weapon wasn't a gun, it was an inappropriate question. He scribbled in the margins of their perfect holy text, "The battle for Earth began." The guards escorted him through the ship. They glided more than walked, their footfalls making no sound on the polished dark flooring that seemed to drink the light. The interior of the Symmetry's Edge was a masterpiece of cold, alien architecture. Walls flowed into floors in perfect sweeping curves, etched with geometric patterns that glowed with a soft internal light, the lines brightening and dimming in slow interlocking waves. The design was meant to intimidate, to overwhelm any visitor with a sense of their own chaotic, asymmetrical inferiority. Emery's, however, wasn't seeing architecture, he was performing a non-invasive autopsy. The glowing light in the walls was a living schematic of the ship's energy flow. He watched the patterns. Based on the wave propagation speed, that's a massive power grid. Superconducting, obviously, but the flicker rate suggests a recurring pulse, a pulse vulnerable to induced resonance. A properly tuned oscillator could introduce catastrophic feedback. The air held that same subtle, sterile tang from the airlock. Atmospheric mix? My suit sensors confirm 72% nitrogen, 26% oxygen, 2% trace noble gases, and... there it is. A complex volatile organic compound. Must be an organic catalyst for their respiratory process. Stable, but I wonder how it reacts to, say, chlorine trifluoride, a potential vulnerability. A constant low-frequency hum vibrated the deck plates, a sound so persuasive it was almost silence. He felt it in the bones of his skull, the superstructure's resonant frequency, approximately 18 hertz, just below human hearing. That consistency meant the entire frame is a single interconnected piece. Strong, but that introduces the risk of symmetric vibration. Get one part to shake uncontrollably, and the whole thing tears itself apart. As he walked, he dragged his right-hand fingers lightly along a sweeping curve of the wall. It felt cool, but with a slight give, a resilience like dense cartilage. Bioalloy, self-repairing, I'd bet. Impressive. But what's its thermal shock tolerance? Its reaction to acid hydrolysis? Everything has a breaking point. The guards remained silent, perfect sentinels leading him deeper into their perfect machine. They saw a small, fleshy biped, awed into silence by their superiority. The creature trailing in their wake mentally cataloged every potential weakness, every exploitable system, turning the ship's perfection into a schematic for its own spectacular destruction. He paced the length of the coffin he intended to build for them. They brought him before High Strategos Volcair, in a grand observation chamber. One entire wall was a viewport, a vast sheet of transparent material showing the besieged Earth in stark, silent, devastating detail. Blue oceans, swirling white clouds, and the angry red blossoms of orbital impacts. Home. Volcair stood with his back to the view, beside a long, polished jet table. He was even taller and more serpentine than his guards, his movements possessing a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. A simple dark robe clung to his slender frame, His elongated head tilted slightly as Emrys entered, his black, pupilless eyes fixing on him with an unnerving intensity. The table held ornate, bizarre alien delicacies that looked more like geological specimens than food. Structures of faceted, light-trapping bismuth sat next to pulsating gelatinous spheres. At the far end of the table sat a single steaming bowl of replicated human chicken noodle soup. Volker gestured to the spread with a long four-fingered hand. "A gesture of peace begins with a shared meal," he said. His voice was a low melodic baritone, perfectly modulated, the sound of calm, absolute authority. Emrys' gaze swept over the alien food, his mind instinctively cataloging potential toxins. He ignored it all and walked to the end of the table, picking up the bowl of soup. It smelled right. He took a cautious sip. His internal analysis was immediate. Perfect sodium chloride levels, flawless protein structure in the replicated chicken, exact nutritional value. Utterly wrong. The broth held no trace of fat, no slight imperfection in the replicated vegetables cut. The soup was an idea, perfectly executed but soulless, a perfect metaphor for the Axiom. "It tastes like home," Emrys said, his voice flat. Volker's thin lips curved in what might have been amusement. "Perfection is a universal language, Doctor." An Axiom attendant placed a small table between them. On it was a human chess set, the pieces carved from some black glossy material. "I have studied your species' games of conflict," Volker said, taking a seat and gesturing for Emrys to do the same. "Most are crude exercises in probability. This one has a certain elegance." They played. Volker's strategy was textbook perfection. He moved his pawns forward in a beautiful symmetrical phalanx, building a flawless fortress. Every move was logical and predictable. Emrys' play was erratic. He developed his pieces aggressively, pushing them into dangerous exposed positions. To a master strategist, his moves would look like an amateur's failings. Halfway through the game, Volker's position was dominant. Then Emrys made his move, a knight sacrifice. He plunged the piece deep into Volker's territory, offering it for free. The move was tactically suicidal. It accomplished nothing except the capture of a single central pawn, the keystone of Volker's beautiful symmetrical structure. Volker paused, his long fingers hovering over his bishop. He didn't take the knight. His gaze dropped from the offered piece to the empty space where his pawn had been. The sacrifice had torn a ragged hole in the heart of his flawless structure. The symmetry was gone, replaced by an ugly, bleeding wound on the board. A dozen weaknesses, invisible moments before, were now laid bare. He looked up from the board's brutal devastation and stared at Emrys. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first crack in his placid facade. "Beautiful," Volker whispered, the word filled with a strange, reverent awe. "Utterly, beautifully irrational. Your goal wasn't victory, it was vandalism. Your strategy is a fascinating data set. Primitive, yet effective in its irrationality. It must be studied." This was the tell, the confirmation of High Command's desperate gamble. Volker was more than a general, he was a scientist of a different sort. He saw the cold, predatory ruthlessness behind Emrys' quiet exterior, and he found it worthy of analysis. As they talked, Emrys subtly observed Volker's physiology. The high strategos moved from his hips when he shifted, a subtle compensation for his elongated torso. A high center of gravity, a biomechanical instability, another data point filed away. The game ended in a stalemate that Emrys was certain Volker engineered. As the guards returned to escort him away, Volker delivered his verdict, his voice soft but carrying immense weight. "You are a predator wearing a scholar's skin, Dr. Emrys. Your leaders were very clever to send you." He leaned forward slightly. "That is why I will keep you alive. I want to see what other beautiful messes you will make before I erase your species from the galaxy." Emrys was shown to his quarters. They were, of course, perfect. Spacious, minimalist, and sterile. The air filtered to human standard. A bed extruded silently from the wall at his approach, the most luxurious prison cell in history. The door sealed behind him with a heavy final thump of magnetic locks. The moment he was alone, Emery's entire demeanor shifted. The slight awkward hunch in his shoulders vanished. His nervous energy was replaced by a cold intensity. He placed his xenobiological survey kit on a small white table that rose from the floor. First, he pulled a small scanner from his pocket and swept the kit for any hidden tracers. Nothing. They were arrogant. Their room surveillance was enough for them. He pressed a specific sequence of indentations on the kit's frame. A soft click, and a false bottom sprang open. Inside, nestled in high-density foam, were no pre-made weapons. The collection of pure, refined elements and catalysts was seemingly innocuous. Small, dense cubes of purified metals for instrument calibration. Pockets of powdered oxides for creating geological test slurries. Vials of inert suspension fluids. To any scan, the contents were a calibration supplement for a high-end science kit. To a chemist with Emery's knowledge, the box held sleeping monsters. He laid them out on the sterile floor, his tools for dissecting an empire. He took a vial of silicate solvent from the main kit and another marked carbon dating accelerant. He began to meticulously mix them in a sample beaker, his hands moving with a lack of any wasted motion. The resulting compound would be his first payload. He was more than a saboteur. He was a weaponsmith. On the second ship rotation, under the pretense of studying the unique atmospheric composition of an Axiom vessel, Emery's was granted a supervised tour of a life support nexus. He feigned academic fascination, peppering his two silent guards with technical questions they ignored. The chamber was a web of humming machinery and conduits glowing with internal light. The ship's lungs. He made a show of taking readings with a handheld sensor. Then, as he passed a primary coolant junction, a thick, ribbed conduit throbbing with supercooled fluid, he feigned clumsiness. He stumbled, lurching forward, and a container of purified water he'd been analyzing slipped from his grasp. It clattered to the floor, the harmless liquid beading on the polished deck. The guards' heads snapped toward the sound, their attention diverted for a bare half-second. The half-second was all he needed. In that flicker of distraction, his other hand moved like a striking viper. He had prepared a small polymer patch, impregnated with the catalytic agent he had synthesized. He slapped it onto the conduit's cool, vibrating underside, into a crevice where two sections joined. The adhesive was instantaneous. The guards looked back at him. He straightened up, an embarrassed expression on his face. "My apologies. Terribly clumsy of me." They stared at him, their black eyes unreadable before one gestured for him to move on. They saw nothing. The patch would be invisible to scans, its material signature blended with the pipe's own bioalloy. Over the next 72 hours, the polymer would dissolve, releasing the agent into the coolant stream. The agent would cause no explosion. It would simply degrade the coolant, subtly reducing its thermal transfer efficiency by a fraction of a percent every hour. The change would be insignificant at first, a ghost in the machine. Over days, as the degradation compounded, it would create a chain reaction of heat management failures across the entire ship. An untraceable, insidious act of sabotage, planted with a clumsy stumble and a quiet apology. Emery's next target was the ship's nervous system, the biogel network. It was the ship's brain, and he was going to give it a stroke. He requested access to a lower deck, citing a need to calibrate my instruments against the ship's gravimetric plating. The excuse was flimsy, but Volcaire's curiosity was a universal access key. He was escorted to a deserted maintenance corridor. He found the service panel he sought. He pried it open with a tool from his kit. The air wafting out was thick with that same organic rain-on-stone smell, but more concentrated. Inside, in the dim light, was a pulsating, translucent mass of gel, threaded with a billion fiber optic filaments that glowed faintly. It was alive. His hands moved with a lack of any wasted motion. He took a sample collection syringe from his kit and, using the kit's high-powered cutting laser on its lowest setting, he micro-machined the tip into a sharp, durable injector. He filled it with a corrosive solvent he had synthesized from a sample sterilizing agent mixed with electrolyte from one of his kit's power packs. He then masked the acid within a nutrient solution. He carefully inserted the modified syringe, splicing the filament into a secondary data node and injecting the fluid. The biogel, sensing nutrients, would absorb the poison and circulate it through its own body. As he worked, the feeling returned, the distinct prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the certainty of being watched. Adrenaline flooded his system. He spun around. The corridor was empty. The guards were at the far end, motionless. The ship's hum was the only sound. This time, he heard something else. A faint, melodic resonance hung in the air for a moment before fading, the same tones as Volkaire's voice. A cold shock, primal and absolute, seized his nervous system. Volkaire knew. He allowed this. He observed it. The clandestine mission had become a performance. The game just escalated. The confrontation was direct. Volkaire found him in the sterile arboretum, a chamber filled with bizarre flora of faceted bismuth that chimed softly in the recycled air. No guards were present. Volkaire circled him like a shark, his movements fluid and silent. He avoided vague accusations. His voice was chillingly specific. A nearby wall became a translucent display, showing a schematic of the ship's coolant system. A single conduit, number 314 Gamma, glowed with an overlay of complex equations. "I have been monitoring the propagation of the thermal inefficiency you introduced," Volkaire began, his voice a low purr. "Fascinating. It flows a chaotic but predictable mathematical decay. Your catalyst signature is ingenious. I could have flushed the system and reversed the effect within seconds, of course." He waved a hand, and the display shifted to a real-time map of the biogel network. A section in sub-corridor Epsilon 7 pulsed with a faint red light. "The same is true for the neurocorrosive agent you introduced here. A statistical ghost, a beautiful tiny ripple of chaos in a sea of perfect order." He turned his full attention to Emery's. "Do you understand, Doctor? I am letting this experiment run its course. You are giving me the blueprint to your species' chaotic soul. Every act of sabotage is a data point, a verse in the epic of human desperation. I will learn how you think, how you break things, and then I will design the perfect unbreakable cage for your entire species." The hubris was a tangible force in the room. He was a god scientist studying a fascinating microbe, confident in his petri dish's sterile perfection. "This is survival," Emery's countered, his voice low and steady. Volkaire smiled faintly. "For now, for you, survival. For me, the acquisition of knowledge. And knowledge is power." The sabotage continued, but its nature changed. The covert operation morphed into a deadly dialogue, a tutorial. His next act was in a primary ventilation shaft. He tainted it with a microscopic aerosol he synthesized. It was a binary compound, inert on its own. While working, he analyzed the ship's energy flows, noting the unique high-frequency energy signature generated when the main weapon system entered a full charge. He carefully calibrated the aerosol. It would remain harmless until exposed to that exact frequency. The ship's own killing stroke would trigger the toxin in its air. Volkaire found him again, on an empty observation deck overlooking the starless dark. They stood side by side, watching the distant swirl of the Milky Way. "You see chaos in that," Volkaire said, gesturing toward the galaxy. "I see a pattern waiting to be perfected, a grand design yearning for a guiding hand. Your species is the same, brilliant, chaotic, but undirected." He turned to Emery's. "Your mind is wasted on mere survival. Stand beside me. Become a researcher in my grand experiment. Help me understand the equation of chaos, and together we will use it to impose a lasting, perfect order on this quadrant. Your fire, guided by my intellect. Does your mind not crave a purpose worthy of its power? For a terrifying second, Emrys felt it. The logic, the grand, awful vision. He recognized the part of himself that saw systems only to dismantle them. And he hated that Volker saw it so clearly. He hated even more that a part of him was tempted. I already have a purpose, Emrys said, turning his back on the stars. Protecting my canvas from artists like you. Volker caught him red-handed. Emrys was in an energy regulation nexus, a heart of plasma conduits and magnetic containment fields. He was about to affix his most audacious device yet, a resonator he'd built from parts of his atmospheric sensor. It was designed to create a feedback loop and overload the plasma conduits during the next weapon's charge. He was exposed, his tools out. Volker emerged from the shadows alone as always. Emrys froze, every muscle tensed. This was it. The game was over. But Volker's expression was one of pure academic fascination. He looked from the complex jury-rigged device in Emrys' hands to the glowing plasma conduit. A harmonic resonator, Volker said, identifying the device's function with a glance. You would use the ship's own power to breach its own containment. The others would have used a bomb. Crude, an external force. You seek to make the system devour itself. Exquisite. Emrys stood motionless. Volker gestured with one long-fingered hand toward the conduit. Please, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Don't let me interrupt your work. The experiment reaches its conclusion. Show me. In that moment, Emrys' entire strategy crystallized. Volker's hubris was more than a shield, it was a leash, and Emrys realized with a jolt of icy clarity that he was the one holding the end of it. He could lead the god scientist anywhere he wanted. The game just entered its final, deadly phase. The pretense was gone. A new, bizarre phase of the game began. Emrys worked openly, and Volker became his silent shadow, his audience of one. Their conversations became a duel of philosophies conducted over the humming machinery Emrys slowly poisoned. They would stand in a secondary command hub while Emrys spliced a logic bomb into a navigation routine. You believe your individuality is strength, Volker would muse, watching Emrys' fingers on a console. I see it as a design flaw, a million separate wills pulling in a million different directions. It's called resilience, Emrys would retort. If one of us fails, the rest adapt. If you fail, Volker, what happens to your perfect order? Volker would simply smile, as if the concept of his own failure was a logical impossibility. Emrys used these terrifyingly intimate sessions to map the mind of his enemy and the anatomy of his prison. He searched for the perfect stage for his final act. In the sterile silence of his quarters, Emrys mapped out his endgame on a datapad. The mission was no longer about crippling the flagship. It was about decapitating the entire Annihilation Fleet. His conversations with Volker confirmed a critical vulnerability. The command structure was a perfect pyramid with Volker at its apex. Every ship was slave to his constant authorization signal. If the apex vanished, the pyramid would fracture. He knew Volker would refuse to allow the symmetry's edge to be destroyed while his experiment was still running. The trap could not target the ship itself. It had to target Volker. It had to be irresistible. He designed a multi-stage cascading failure. It would begin with his time bombs creating a ship-wide crisis. The final stage would be a spectacular but controlled meltdown in the main bioengineering laboratory. The lab was Volker's personal scientific domain, a place he would surely investigate personally. And most importantly, the lab shared a reinforced wall with an external waste disposal airlock, a back door to the starless dark. The stage was chosen. Emrys initiated the final sequence by creating a simple chemical reaction in a service junction that shorted out a minor power relay. The gentle push. Across the ship, his dominoes began to fall. The degraded coolant he engineered days ago finally reached its critical point, unable to compensate for the minor energy fluctuation caused by the short. Heat sinks flashed red on displays ship-wide. Seconds later, the poisoned biogel, pushed to its computational limit by the heat crisis, finally corrupted a core command packet. A chain reaction of system glitches erupted across the bridge. Phantoms appeared on long-range sensors. The ship, believing it was under some kind of phantom attack while also suffering critical heat failures, automatically began to shunt power to its main weapon systems for a full-scale planetary bombardment, just as Emery's knew it would. Finally, he triggered his device in the biolab. It was a rapid exothermic chemical reaction designed for maximum effect. A brilliant silent flash of light, a massive release of inert but visually dramatic vapor, and the shriek of a dozen localized alarms. On the main bridge, every diagnostic system pointed to one place: a single critical failure in the High Strategos' personal laboratory, happening at the exact moment the ship prepared to fire. The bait was set. Volker arrived at the biolab just as Emery's predicted. Glowing energy fields sealed the corridor. The High Strategos swept through them, a calm island in a sea of controlled panic. The chamber beyond was a carefully orchestrated scene of chaos. Emergency lights strobed in the thick, swirling vapor. Pipes that Emery's had pre-scored vented harmless steam with a terrifying hiss. Alarms blared a symphony of panic. And Emery stood at the center of it all, frantically manipulating a control panel, appearing as a lone scientist desperately trying to contain a disaster he had secretly created. Volker's guards moved to follow him in, but Volker raised a single hand, halting them. "Wait here," he commanded. "This is not for your eyes." His expression held only transcendent, ecstatic focus. He was not a commander walking into a crisis. He was a scientist, about to witness the sublime final result of his grand experiment. He stepped through the energy field alone, and the doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him inside with his creation. Volker approached through the swirling steam, his serpentine form cutting through the chaos like a phantom. The noise of the alarm seemed to fade. He stopped a few feet from Emery's, his black eyes shining. "You are like me," he said, his voice filled with a tone of final, triumphant discovery. "An apex predator, ruthless, intelligent, a monster in all but name." Emery stopped his frantic act. He turned slowly from the console, and the panicked scientist was gone. His face was suddenly chillingly calm. The predator Volker always saw was finally looking back at him. "The difference between us, Volker," Emery said, his voice flat and hard, "is that I chose a side." In one fluid, explosive motion, Emery's lunged. As he moved, his thumb brushed a control on a small device on his belt, his repurposed geological scanner. A silent, localized EM pulse burst from it. The pulse was no weapon. It had no effect on Volker's body, but for a single critical microsecond, it scrambled the bioelectric signals from Volker's brain to his muscles. The intellectual, unused to physical violence, commanded his body to react, but the command arrived a fraction of a second too late. That fraction of a second was all Emery's needed. His lunge was a move of pure calculated physics, exploiting the high center of gravity he had noted days ago. Volker's momentum, his surprise, and the momentary neuromuscular lag did the work. He stumbled backward, off balance. Emery's drove forward, slamming him hard against the reinforced inner door of the waste disposal airlock. The High Strategos realized the truth in the instant before impact. The chaos was a stage. Emery's hand was already on the emergency cycle panel. Checkmate. Volker didn't struggle. Pinned against the cold metal of the inner airlock door, he simply looked at Emery's. The expression in his vast black eyes held neither anger nor fear. It was something that looked unbelievably like pride, a serene final understanding. The klaxon for the airlock cycle screamed, and the massive outer door began to iris open, to the hard vacuum of space. The vapor in the room was instantly sucked toward the opening. Volker raised one of his four-fingered hands and pressed it against the inner door's thick viewport. His thin lips moved. Through the ship's internal comm system, still active in his uniform, a single whispered word, laced with awe and admiration, reached Emery's ear as the inner door shot open. Voltaire was flung silently into the star-dusted quiet. Beautiful! The instant Voltaire's command signal vanished, the Axiom Annihilation Fleet descended into civil war. The result was a succession crisis, not paralysis. The signal that was the single source of truth for the entire network simply ceased to exist. Voltaire's second-in-command aboard the Symmetry's Edge immediately attempted to assert control, his command codes flashing across the fleet. But on another capital ship, the Perfect Vector, an ambitious rival commander did the same. The network, designed for one absolute voice, fractured. Ships began receiving contradictory orders. On the flagship's bridge, officers stared in horror as a command to hold formation was overridden by a command from the Perfect Vector to fire on a sister ship that was following the first order. The fleet's perfect arrangements shattered as ships swerved to obey one commander while being fired upon by ships obeying another. The Annihilation Fleet was blind, leaderless, and tore itself apart from the inside. Just beyond sensor range, the waiting human fleet had one simple, elegant instruction: jump the instant the Axiom commanded authority signal ceased to exist. That signal vanished. 100 human warships tore into reality. They found a fleet locked in a brief, vicious, and utterly self-destructive battle. They fell upon the bewildered, warring Axiom like a pack of wolves, their chaotic tactics perfectly suited to exploit the internecine chaos. Amidst the pandemonium he had created, Emery's navigated his way to the escape pod bay. He was a ghost moving through a haunted house of his own making. The ship itself was his cover. Lights flickered and died, steam vented from ruptured pipes, and the corridors filled with stumbling, disoriented Axiom whose perfect discipline had been chemically burned away. They barely registered his presence. He found a one-man pod, cycled the door, and launched himself into the gulf between worlds. The small craft streaked away from the dying flagship as a human destroyer slammed a spread of torpedoes into its midsection, breaking its perfect spine. He watched the battle rage, a decisive victory forged from a lie. He won. Humanity would survive. His pod oriented itself toward home. In the viewport, the distant, perfect blue marble of Earth grew larger. He clutched the pod's controls, his knuckles white, Voltaire's final haunting word echoing in the silent cockpit. Beautiful. He stared at his home, place he had just saved through an act of monstrous, beautiful destruction, and a terrible, undeniable truth struck him. He was the predator who chose to be human, to make the choice to be kind and protective, rather than cruel and destructive. Wasn't he? That thought, cold and sharp, was his only companion in the silence of the pod. Then a new sound cut through the quiet, a proximity alert, followed by the gentle shudder of a tractor beam. A voice, warm and human and crackling with static, filled the cockpit. "Rescue craft Rust Hound to unknown human pod. We have you. Welcome home, Doctor." The transition was a jarring, beautiful shock. One moment, he was in a sterile, silent cocoon. The next, the pod hatch was cranked open into a corridor buzzing with life. The air tasted of ozone, sweat, and hot coffee. It was the smell of humanity, and it was overwhelming. General Odia was there to meet him, his face no longer a ceramic mask of desperation, but etched with deep lines of exhaustion and incandescent relief. They walked onto the bridge of the flagship Defiance. It was the antithesis of the Symmetry's Edge. Consoles were cluttered with data pads and half-empty mugs. Officers shouted updates across the room, their voices overlapping in a symphony of controlled chaos. On the main view screen, the Axiom fleet was a field of shattered splinters and blinking distress signals, harried and torn apart by the smaller, faster human ships. "He called it a beautiful mess," Emery said, his voice raspy. He hadn't realized he hadn't spoken aloud since Odia turned to him. "What's that, Doctor?" Emery's finally looked away from the view screen, meeting the general's gaze. He saw the question in the older man's eyes, the unspoken inquiry into the cost of this victory. Voltaire, his final words. He saw what I was doing, what I was... and he called it beautiful. The admission felt like shedding a skin. He saw a monster. Odia placed a heavy, steadying hand on Emery's shoulder. The contact was grounding, real. "He saw a predator," the general corrected, his voice low but firm enough for only Emery's to hear amidst the bridge's clamor. "He was right. But a predator isn't a monster, Doctor. A predator is a survivor. Its purpose is to ensure its own kind continues. You just reminded the galaxy what it means when humanity decides to survive." Emery's looked past the general at the faces on the bridge crew. He saw the fierce joy, the grim determination, the sheer beautiful chaotic humanity of it all. His hands, which had been clenched into tight fists since he'd stepped onto the Axiom flagship, finally uncurled. The cold, precise chemist who had built a weapon of galactic consequence, the predator who had stalked his prey through a perfect metal tomb, felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with physics or chemistry. He was an apex predator, yes, but he was also a defender, and he was home. Across the star-dusted void, the last remnants of the Axiom's perfect silent order were broken against the loud, messy, indomitable will of a species that refused to go quietly into the dark. They had sent their artists of annihilation, their architects of oblivion, their flawless geometric fleet. Humanity's answer echoed back across the cosmos, not in a single perfect note, but in a chorus of 1 billion defiant voices, a symphony of beautiful, terrible, unbreakable rebellion. Their perfect equation had been solved. The answer was human.